Thank you, Rob, for your inspiring words and for your generosity of financial abundance and your generosity of spirit. And also for reminding us that we are part of a living legacy, a living tradition, streams of faith that flow from times past to our current day, streams of faith that flow ever onward. And today we turn our attention to the rivers of grace that flow from our Universalist heritage. And before I start, I have some questions for you, because they're the very questions that our earlier Universalist ancestors thought about a lot. So the first question is, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the word God? You have it? Will you turn to someone near you and share what comes to mind when you hear the word God? And if you're online, you can type into the chat. Okay, next question. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the word sin? A little juicier, this one, maybe. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the word sin? Will you turn and share that with someone near you? And one more, and I think this one may get even juicier. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the word hell? You got it? I'm going to turn to a neighbor and tell them the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the word hell. So, that cacophony of voices that you just heard, with the diversity of thoughts and ideas and beliefs that were expressed here just now, is what it means to be part of a community that embraces pluralism. Many faith traditions, many ways of being religious, many ways of being spiritual or not. If we listened closely, we likely would have heard a wide spectrum of beliefs, some of them maybe even conflicting and contradictory. We also would have heard some congruence and some commonality. And so within this mix, you may find a couple of temptations arising in you. One may be to conclude that to be Unitarian Universalist means that you can believe whatever you want. Another might be to look for the commonalities as the definition of Unitarian Universalism. Neither of these is completely accurate. Our principles and values tell us that we are on a responsible search for truth and meaning together. As individuals, our vision is too narrow, our knowledge incomplete. We need each other to see all that must be seen and know all that can be known. There's a gentle balance of holding one's own beliefs and perspectives while being open to hearing from and maybe even changed by others. So while finding commonalities can give us solid ground to move from, if we defined Unitarian Universalism only by what we believed in common, we would no longer be pluralistic. Our vision would narrow and our knowledge would be incomplete. Our challenge, then, is like that of our Universalist ancestor, Angus MacLean, whose father taught him to face the steady breeze until the wind sings in both ears, and then notice where the nose points. Our challenge is to face into our differences until the wind sings in both ears and our nose points in the direction of love, which is the word that comes to mind for me, for God. Our Universalist ancestors believed in a God too good and too loving to punish sins by condemning anyone to an eternity in hell. Even so, those who claimed the name Universalist were far from uniform in their beliefs. Their answers to those questions we just talked about would have been different from each other. And their differences often led to controversy and arguments and even almost schism. Some, like John Murray, believed that everyone was already saved and would be taken up into heaven immediately upon death. Others, like Elihanan Winchester, believed that some sins were so severe and grievous that those who committed them would need a period of punishment before they could be redeemed, restored, and taken up to heaven. John Murray left England broken-hearted, and broken by life. Upon release from debtor's prison, with his son and his wife both dead, and he, having been banished from his Methodist pulpit for preaching a gospel of universal salvation, John Murray boarded a ship named Hand in Hand, a ship headed for New York. His intent was to start a new life. He vowed he would never preach again. When the ship Hand in Hand was blown off course and landed on an island off the coast of New Jersey, things changed for John Murray. On the island, he struck a deal with Thomas Potter, a farmer on the island who was waiting for a minister to preach in the chapel he had built on his farm. Not just any minister, but one who would preach a gospel of universal salvation. The deal was that if, come Sunday, the winds changed and the boat had sailed for New York, it would be a sign from God that Murray's decision to never preach again was the right one. If, on the other hand, come Sunday, the boat was still stuck on the island, that too would be a sign, and Murray would preach in Thomas Potter's chapel. Sunday morning came, and the boat was still stuck on the island. And so it was that on September 30th, 1770, John Murray preached a sermon about a God too good and too loving to damn anyone to punishment in hell. The Universalist message of the power of love was good news to the many who heard, for the prevailing message of their time was that they were sinners in the hands of an angry God, or that the nature of humanity was total depravity. So you can imagine what a breath of fresh air John Murray's message was on that day. He continued to preach and went on to found Universalism in America. Meanwhile, Elihanan Winchester was already busy spreading a Universalist message throughout New England, and he made it as far south as South Carolina, where he was called to serve a Baptist church in the town of Welsh Neck, a Baptist church where he preached a Universalist message. There he has said to have added 140 white members to the church and converted 100 enslaved people to Universalism. He even started a church just for them, despite the resistance of his white congregants. Winchester ministered to both his white church and his black church, preaching not of universal salvation in the way that Murray was, but what he called universal restoration. The belief that all souls would eventually be restored in union with God. And it's hard to say which was more controversial in mainstream American culture of the time, his Universalist views or his anti-slavery views. So Winchester didn't last long in South Carolina. He left Welsh Neck and slowly made his way back north, preaching along the way. While John Murray and Elihanan Winchester met and both worked to support the cause of Universalism, they never were on friendly terms. They supported each other in public. Murray encouraged financial support for Winchester's church in Philadelphia, where he finally landed, even though Murray had serious reservations about Winchester's theology. Both went on to preach and be very successful and serve successful congregations. And as I tell these two stories, a more contemporary Universalist comes to mind, Gordon McKeeman, who died in 2013. He was fond of saying, if we're all going to heaven together someday, we may as well learn to get along now. I tell these stories to lift up the truth that there has always been more than one way to be a Universalist, just like today there is more than one way to be a Unitarian Universalist, that we can think and believe differently, knowing that we are held together in a mutual covenant of love. Today, we are less focused on an otherworldly afterlife than our ancestors were. We turn our attention to here and now and the systemic sins of oppression, exploitation, and marginalization that create living hells here on earth. Our work is to eradicate them. The salvation we seek is a collective liberation, knowing that no one of us is free until all of us are free, that none of us are saved unless all of us are saved. I believe that much as things have changed, that people like John Murray and Ella Hannon Winchester would recognize today's universalism by the rivers of grace flowing through. Love freely given, love that cannot be earned or taken away. Today, we can't be sure that we all mean the same thing when we say God, so we speak instead of a universal love holding us all. When the winds of change blow strong through our days, when it can be hard to know which beliefs are good and true and right, we will know that we are headed in the right direction when the wind in both ears sings in tune with the frequency of love. Contemporary Unitarian Universalist theologian Rebecca Parker writes, "Even when our hearts are broken by our own failure or the failure of others, cutting into our lives, even when we have done all we can and life is still broken, there is a universal love that has never broken faith with us and never will." My friends, I know this to be true. There is a source of life from which we can never be ultimately severed, an ultimate source of love that can neither be earned nor taken away, a love which flows in ever-abundant rivers of grace. May it be so today and always.